Good afternoon. I'm Scott Miller, President of Virginia Wesleyan University in Virginia Beach and Chair of the Climate Leadership Network, a board member of Second Nature, and your moderator for today's panel. Yes, I am from Virginia. I'm not in the national news, and no, I'm not involved in any national scandal. So let's get that out of the way first. Before we begin, special kudos to Tim and the staff of Second Nature. This event is a sellout. They had to stop taking enrollments in it because of the wonderful program that's been put together, and kudos to Tim and his entire staff for a job well done. If you are not a college or university president, and your president is not here with you, be sure and recruit them to come to this event next year and make it a priority. Our focus in this session is on resilience, the disaster economy, and climate justice. Each community, even within a similar region or in close proximity to one another, have very different responses to disasters. We have presidential panelists who have experiences in the Caribbean who can speak to this dynamic. There may also be different roles between universities impacted by disasters versus those outside that can assist with recovery and preparedness. Disasters shine a light on and exacerbate existing social issues. They don't necessarily create them. Resilience activities involve addressing these issues and building capacity during the non-disaster periods. Universities that are embedded in the fabric of a city like Pittsburgh or Boston can unintentionally exacerbate the vulnerabilities, and adopting holistic resilience frameworks can help prevent that from happening. Investment, including endowments in minority-owned businesses and climate solutions, can support community resiliency and drive the financial system in new directions. So let's get started. To my immediate right, with the introductions, Dr. Kathy Jacobs. Kathy is the director of the Center for Climate Adaptation Science and Solutions at the University of Arizona. Next to Dr. Jacobs, Mr. Anthony Rust, trustee and chair of the investment committee at Warren Wilson College and partner in Caribbean Private Equity Partners. He's followed by Dr. David Hall, president of the University of Virgin Islands, and Dr. Javidan Rodriguez, president of the University of Albany. Full bios are in your program, so I want to thank all of you for being with us today. Our purpose for the panel is to explore how campuses can make themselves more resilient to impacts of climate change. We'll also examine the social justice implications and greater vulnerability of marginalized communities and less wealthy institutions. So our format for this session: each panelist will present for about 5 minutes about their institutions and related areas. There will be some redirect follow-up. Then we will open the floor for questions, and at the end of this session, we'll ask each panelist to provide a takeaway from this session. First off, my campus, Virginia Wesleyan University, is located in coastal Virginia, which, as you can imagine, leaves us quite vulnerable to climate change, coastal sea rise and flooding, and other threats such as hurricanes. In fact, most studies place us first, second, or third in sea level rise risk. I'd like to share with you the steps that we've taken to address these issues and plan for a safer, more sustainable future. Simultaneously, we've incorporated these topics into our curriculum. And I'm also proud to say that Virginia Wesleyan was one of the charter signatories of the climate commitment, a reflection of the university's dedication to ethical conduct and social responsibility through environmental stewardship and education. It has provided countless contacts and no-cost resources. Again, encourage your presidents to get involved in this organization because there are free resources available to your institutions through the valuable networking that occurs through presidential involvement. It's important for administrators to recognize that the need for comprehensive community resilience planning to prepare for climate and weather-related threats. In our planning, I formed a primary sustainability group on campus, the President's Environmental Issues Council, PIEC, which reports directly to me. The group interacts on campus and in the community and in the region on important issues on my behalf. The PIEC formed a resilience subcommittee to focus more intensively on ensuring resilience. The committee hosted the Nature Conservancy Community Resilience Building Workshop in our new state-of-the-art Greer Environmental Sciences Center. We're located on the Virginia Beach-Norfolk line. The city of Norfolk has a huge grant and a new chief resilience officer who's been actively involved with our key stakeholders and offered to be a resource for our campus resilience planning. Norfolk is our neighboring city and one of the 100 resilient cities pioneered by the Rockefeller Foundation. The workshop produced a campus community resilience assessment, a report that guided further planning and preparation for recovery from weather-related and other emergencies. I urge our colleges and universities to reach out to their communities if they have not already for this kind of essential partnership. As I mentioned, it's important for administrators to not only recognize the need for resilience planning, but to be active participants in it as well. One president affected by a disaster said to me, "Don't just assign it to someone else. You can have your team's plan all you want until you actually experience it. Get involved as a president and a senior administrator." I'm a member of the Virginia Beach Sea Level Rise Task Force, which meets monthly to discuss issues related to primary climate-related hazard in our area, primarily flooding and sea level rise. The task force keeps this important issue at the forefront among government officials, colleges and universities, and the local community. Additionally, my president's cabinet identified the need for a continuity operations plan to ensure that mission essential functions continued to be performed during a wide range of emergencies, including localized acts of nature as well as accidents, technology, or other disruptive events. A representative from the Virginia Beach Office of Emergency Management facilitated a campus committee. This preparation is to develop a relevant and effective plan to allow us to respond to a crisis of any kind, including acts of nature, which is critical to ensuring not only the continuous performance of our institution's essential functions and operations, number one being delivery of education during an emergency, but also to protect essential facilities, equipment, records, and other assets, to achieve a timely and orderly recovery from an emergency and to resume full service to our students and other constituencies. While it's extremely important to work with our local cities and experts, host planning committees, events, and convene committees that engage stakeholders, addressing these challenges through the curriculum is also vital. The academic commitment Virginia Wesleyan has made to educate our students about the sustainability threats we face is consistent with our mission and emergency planning. We need to accept and embrace that we are handing off our precious earth to the next generation. Therefore, we must convey awareness of policy issues and decision-making along with the science. In fact, an important component of our environmental sciences program is discussion of public policy affecting the natural world. Our goal is to equip our students with the leadership skills required to make informed judgments and decisions about environmental stewardship. Consider the legacy of coastal sea rise, extreme weather, loss of biodiversity, and resource depletion we're leaving to our children and our grandchildren. They'll never forgive us if we don't take advantage of the narrowing window to reduce greenhouse gases, save species, and foster sustainability. This includes not only making our campuses more resilient now to such threats, but also educating our students and providing them with the necessary tools to be environmental stewards and advocates in their communities, their states, and the nation years from now. I hope this overview of the steps we've taken as an institution is helpful to your own institution. Look forward to continuing the conversation with the perspective of our panelists. Next up, Dr. Jacobs.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I have sort of a dual challenge before me because I'm actually an imposter. I'm not listed on the program. And in addition, I was told by the president or the chairman of the board that I'm not supposed to say anything stupid. So I will do whatever I can to achieve that. So I am from the University of Arizona, but I have a long history of working with stakeholders and engaging with communities. And I wanted to share some of that perspective with you because I think it has a lot to do with what building resilience is all about. Because I've worked on water for a very long time, I think I got pulled into this issue of climate resilience because water is essentially the delivery mechanism of climate impacts. And so it's really important for people who are water managers to have some perspective on what it is that's going on out there. But again, much of what is happening is between the science and the stakeholders. In other words, the connecting of the science and the people who are making decisions seems to be the big gap in resilience for at least many of us. And so I've really focused for most of my career on this issue of connecting science and decision making, and what is it that we can do to prepare people for disasters before they happen, to anticipate what might be happening in the future. The problem is it's very hard to provide incentives for people to engage in that way until there is a disaster. In other words, people just don't normally mobilize and get into these positions where they're willing to work with each other if they haven't experienced anything like that in the past. So there's a big challenge in understanding what motivates people, whether it's people in academia or people in communities, to make these kinds of decisions and to move into a posture where they are already well integrated and prepared before these events happen. So I've really focused quite a bit on this issue of inclusiveness and how is it that stakeholders can be engaged in a meaningful way. Because I've seen so many opportunities for stakeholders to be part of processes where in fact they're used as window dressing. They aren't really part of the conversation, and it isn't because they don't want to be, but in many cases they're actually not, they don't have the capacity to be. If you have had anything to do with water management at all, you know it's an incredibly complicated situation out there. Just as an example, the state of California has something like 5,000 different water utilities at different scales. And so there's all these different people making decisions in different contexts with different rules. And most people are not even aware of how different the context of every stakeholder is. And so when you've got all this complexity out there, it's hard to help stakeholders actually be part of the conversation. If you're not an expert, you often are dismissed. And I've seen that happen over and over again. So what is real engagement, and how do you build capacity for stakeholders to be part of the conversation? And how do you do it in an anticipatory way so that you actually are prepared for something you don't even know what it is yet? How do you build that capacity without really knowing what the next big disaster might be? These are all major questions. So I think part of it has to do with institutional arrangements and the way we build relationships between universities and communities and universities and decision makers, elected officials, and so forth. How do you build those trusted relationships so that you are truly prepared for what is going to come when you don't actually know what that is yet? We heard this morning from Michael Crow about the need to be either anti or post-disciplinary. And I think in my case, I'm sort of pre-disciplinary. The reality is I actually don't have a PhD. I am an imposter in other ways as well. So I actually worked for 25 years as a water manager for the state of Arizona before I came to the university. But I think the fact that I've had this lived experience in the real world, working both at the local level and at the national level, where I ran the U.S. National Climate Assessment, I've had the opportunity to see how powerful networks of people can be, how you can really work together with people and empower them to be engaged through networks and be able to solve problems in ways they might not otherwise have. There are an awful lot of pitfalls to engagement, but there are so many benefits to this kind of deliverance of the relationships that are necessary to build a community that includes a whole range of stakeholders who are affected by the huge range of climate-related impacts. So I'm sure I'll have more opinions later on But I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Anthony, what's happening in the financial world?
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. So I wear two hats. I'm a trustee at Warren Wilson College in Asheville, North Carolina, where I chair the investment committee that oversees the endowment fund. But I also professionally am a private equity investor with a firm called the Caribbean Private Equity Partners. And the reason that I was asked really to be on this session is to talk about the aftermath of Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria on the Caribbean, and some of the efforts that are being undertaken on a resiliency framework platform going forward. So one, let me first say that as an active investor in the region, we have a vested interest in making sure that the region is as prepared as possible for the new normal, right? So that means two things. The region is still on a preventative basis, seeking to reduce its carbon footprint and its dependency on petroleum. And there are several renewable energy initiatives in various countries in the Caribbean to be renewable energy based energy economies by 2025. So that's good. But on the resiliency side, there are several initiatives that are currently going on, and nothing really moves people like a disaster. But understanding that this time, and we've had hurricanes in the Caribbean before, but understanding that the veracity of these hurricanes are so much stronger than they've ever been before, and the frequency, this really has emboldened the private sector as well as the public sector, governments in the Caribbean, to really develop a sustainable resiliency framework. What does that look like? One of the major things that's happening, particularly on the private sector, is there's a move to mandate that all businesses, private sector businesses, develop contingency and business continuity plans, right? So that's not something that's unique to the United States. I work in the financial services investment industry, and it's a mandated requirement that all investment firms, broker-dealers, as well as other industries have business continuity plans. In the Caribbean, most large businesses have business continuity plans, BCP plans. However, SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, make up the majority of the businesses that you find in the Caribbean. And most of those businesses either don't have a BCP plan, or their plans are outdated and not meant to handle the level of devastation that you're seeing. So there's a tremendous effort now to have each small, medium-sized enterprise in the Caribbean develop these BCP plans. I'll give you one example. Our firm is a medium-sized enterprise. We have offices in Kingston, Jamaica, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Philadelphia. When our office in San Juan was wiped out by the hurricane, it took 2 months to get back up and running. But because we had our Kingston office, because we had our Philadelphia office, our operations were uninterrupted. In the event that Kingston and San Juan get hit, we still have stateside office in Philadelphia to handle that. But we have the resources to do that. Most SMEs in the Caribbean don't have those resources. So there is an initiative on the part of government and the private sector, and I mean government, multiple governments in the Caribbean, to develop individualized business continuity plans that are realistic for each SME operates in the Caribbean. The Canadian government has committed funds with the Disaster Risk Reduction Center to implement this program across several Caribbean nations. So that's one example. An additional example, specific example, is many Caribbean nations are looking at creating regional, virtual, and physical workspaces, so that if in the event that a country's SME sector is hit hard, they have the ability to operate out of a neighboring Caribbean nation in these virtual or physical workspaces. And then a third example along those lines is many Caribbean nations now are developing storage facilities, so that products, goods, or equipment in advance of a hurricane coming can be moved and located in a bunker-type facility or as hurricane-proof as you can get facility in these countries. St. Martin's, I'm just going to highlight St. Martin's and as an example. We've done a lot of work in St. Martin's and the BVI, but St. Martin's in particular, as most of you probably know, St. Martin's has a Dutch side and a French side. And talk about where investment pays off. So after Hurricane Julio in 1995, the Dutch side made a commitment to bury its power lines, right? They put the money out, made that infrastructure investment to bury its power lines, right? The French side did not. After the recent hurricanes of 2017, it took the Dutch St. Martin's side 7 days to get power back to most of the country, right? There's still parts of the French St. Martin's, still neighborhoods that don't have power. So that type of investment, resiliency investment, is happening now in the aftermath. So the French St. Martin's side is thinking about burying its power lines. The BVI now is thinking about burying its power lines, right? In addition, Dutch St. Martin's side had invested heavily in its water production facilities, right? So when the hurricanes hit, right, their water was they had distribution problems, but the production of water for the country was largely untouched. So these are some of the benefits that you're seeing of a resilient investment, resilient framework that hopefully now is being spread to other parts of the Caribbean. And I think one last thing I would say is there are funds coming from various sources to help rebuild the Caribbean, the most countries that are affected. There's a Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Fund that is a pooled vehicle that's able to provide some funds for the devastation that's taken place. The Dutch government has provided about $580 million for the other issues that Dutch St. Martin's has in terms of physical structure damages. The Dutch St. Martin government is upgrading building standards now. So prior to these two hurricanes, the regulations required that windows that are installed in the Dutch side of St. Martin's withstand 160 mile an hour winds. Those standards now have been raised to 200 mile an hour winds, right? Rooftops now, any new construction is going to have to be built with concrete. So some of those, these are some examples of some of the investments that are happening and the policy changes that are happening in the Caribbean, which shows you what could be done, the right way to do it, and the way that some of the countries now that are less resilient are moving.
Thank you, Anthony.
Sure.
Our two presidents down at the end, we're going to let you talk a little bit about your campuses, but also what role do presidents have in driving the resilience activities facing your campuses. David Hall, you've been president for 10 years now at the University of Virgin Islands. Yeah. Would you share with us some of your thoughts?
Yeah, excuse me, I'll be glad to, and it's an honor to be on this panel with such distinguished individuals. Let me describe briefly just a little bit about the University of the Virgin Islands, and then I really would like to focus on that question of what is the role of a president in this particular setting. The University of the Virgin Islands, of course, was enormously impacted by Hurricane Irma and Maria. We lost 10 buildings across both of our campuses, one on St. Thomas, the other on St. Croix. Infrastructure, internet, all of those kind of basic things that we grow to live with and appreciate were impacted. The landscape looked like a war zone. So living through that type of experience and seeing yourself as being an integral person to guide an institution through that experience is very, very challenging. And so the first, there are 5 levels that I'd like to kind of talk about quickly as to what is the role of a president in the context of disaster and also in the context of trying to create a culture of resiliency in an academic setting. The first is being able to tap into your own resiliency during and immediately after the disaster, whatever it is. For me and for the university, it was 2 Category 5 hurricanes within a 2-week period. Not something I signed up for when I became president, but that is what I had to live through, and that is what the university and the territory had to live through as well. And I came out of that realizing that leadership resiliency is so much a product of the emotional and spiritual health of the leader. Because though we had plans that told us everything we needed to do in this type of emergency, there was not a plan for what I needed to be able to tap into internally to be able to deal with the various things I saw and to be able to guide the institution forward. And so I really do believe that from a human resiliency standpoint, that there is so much we need to explore about emotional intelligence and spiritual intelligence that any leader, including a university president, need to understand going through a disaster. So that's level number one, and I could talk in greater detail about that. The second one, though, is trying to create a vision and a strategic direction for the institution around resiliency. One of the privileges of being a president in an academic environment is people do look to you to try to create a vision as to where are we headed as an institution, what are our priorities. And though it may be a collaborative process in creating that vision or that strategic plan, the role of a president in articulating that and trying to make those hard decisions are very important. So coming out of the 2 hurricanes that we faced, we were right in the midst of creating a strategic plan for the university for the next 5 years. And though we had already talked about the concept of innovation and the concept of resiliency, it crystallized having gone through that experience. And so the theme of the new strategic plan is greatness through innovation. And that's not just a slogan, but throughout the plan, it is incentivizing innovation throughout the institution. It is saying that's how we're going to measure individuals and measure units, and that's how we're going to measure ourselves as an institution. So part of the challenge that President Crow was throwing out this morning, which is that, we need to rethink how our institutions operate, is very real. And that's how we hope to use the strategic plan. And that's the vision that I tried to articulate, that this is something we must do. We have no choice in regards to it if we are going to survive as a university, but more importantly, if we're going to help lead the territory forward.
Great.
The third level of what I think is important for a university president is creating institutional structures that can allow that vision or allow those concepts to really take root. And I will share one example of that. 7 years ago, we created a Caribbean Center for Green Technology in consultation with some legislators, former governors, and at that time, we only envisioned it as being an entity that could do research around what is the best renewable energy policy that the government of the Virgin Islands should adopt. And in its early stage, it did a wonderful job of doing that. But over time, and especially coming out of the hurricanes, this little small center has now become the focal point for creating and monitoring climate change throughout the Virgin Islands, observing the ocean changes in temperature, and recently securing a $5 million grant from FEMA to create a resiliency and disaster mitigation center, which will help not the university, but help the entire Virgin Islands to create a plan for dealing with the next hurricane and being better prepared in every aspect of its life. And so this small center, created for one purpose, allowed us to have in place a structure that made it easier for us to respond to the call of the local government, of the community, to be able to address its needs. The next level is empowering individuals to carry out this work, because no one president can do all of the things that need to be done in this particular area. And so at the cabinet level, but also at the institutional level, everyone has to understand that they are empowered to take this vision and make it a reality. So the resources that have come into the center is not because of grants that I have written, but because those individuals knew they had the license to go out and try to make this happen. And again, I can talk more about that. But the last one is trying to secure the resources to make resiliency a reality in your institution. And that, of course, is the hardest one. And the two examples I want to focus on in that regard is that, as I indicated, we lost 10 buildings across our campuses. And it is my responsibility of securing the resources to make sure that not only are those structures rebuilt, but they are rebuilt in a more resilient manner. And so one would not expect that you would have to struggle with your insurance company to get the resources that they owe you. But a year and a half since the hurricanes, we are just finally closing our case with our insurance carrier. The FEMA process, that's not only sending in an application, that's also advocacy that has to occur just to get those resources, trying to get other federal dollars to come to the campus, and trying to use the endowment in certain ways to help bring about this transformation. And the last example that I will share to kind of close these remarks is that we tend to overlook the human capital that needs to be invested within. And so one of the very positive things that occurred to us just last month was, through the advocacy of the university and my own advocacy, we were able to get the local government, a year and a half coming out of a catastrophic experience, to adopt and pass legislation that provides free tuition to every Virgin Islander who graduates from a Virgin Island high school, no matter when they graduated, whether that's 5 or 10 years ago. And the reason I focus on that as a part of resiliency is that in an environment where only 11.4% of the adult residents have college degrees, then it is a priority for the government to invest in ensuring that more individuals obtain college degrees so that they can address so much of the inequities and economic inequalities that exist even in a paradise like the Virgin Islands. So that's just another example of trying to secure the resources, not only to build a structure, but to help build the people of a particular area as well. So there are many other levels that I'm sure the presidents who are here and others can talk about, but those 5 have really crystallized what I feel I am being charged to do on a day in and day out basis.
Very good, thank you, David. President Rodriguez, Albany and also the president's role.
Thank you very much, Scott, and good afternoon to everybody. Muy buenas tardes, as we say in Puerto Rico. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. In the short time that has been allotted to me, I really want to focus on 2 major areas. And one is the critical need for us to understand the pre-existing conditions that may exist in any particular area that's impacted by one of these hazard events. That is the social, the economic, the demographic, economic and political conditions that already exist in a particular area. are critically important to understand the devastating impacts of a disaster. And they're even more important when you start thinking about the response, the recovery, and the reconstruction efforts. Also, I want to emphasize the critical role that institutions of higher education can play in the response, recovery, and reconstruction efforts in areas that are impacted by events. And I will do this in the context of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. I think it's important for you to know that for the past 25 years or so, my research has focused on the socioeconomic impacts of disasters. Actually, I'm asked what is the best preparation to become a president of a university, and I say, well, get engaged in the socioeconomic impacts of disasters, and that's a good preparation to lead you forward. So as has been said, I am the president of the University at Albany, of the State University of New York, or the SUNY system. As you already know, Hurricane Maria was a devastating event for Puerto Rico. It was catastrophic. It was the worst hurricane that had impacted Puerto Rico for over 100 years. And so Puerto Rico and the entire infrastructure was devastated by a technically Category 4 hurricane, but a few miles shy of a Category 5 hurricane. So an event of this magnitude would be devastating for any geographical area, including Puerto Rico. But we must understand the impact of this event within the demographic, social, economic, and political context in which it occurred. Thus, disasters are not natural. Disasters are socially constructed events that depend on a number of factors that existed in Puerto Rico, or in Louisiana and Mississippi following Katrina, or in India and Sri Lanka, or in Indonesia following the Indian Ocean tsunami. In the context of Puerto Rico, these pre-existing conditions exacerbated the impacts of Hurricane Maria. And as we call it in a book that we just recently published, a couple of colleagues and I, these situations, economic, social situations, created the ideal situations or the optimal conditions that resulted in a perfect storm. That is, the storm in Puerto Rico had really been brewing for decades on the island as a result of an economic crisis. You may have known that Puerto Rico has been characterized by high levels of poverty, inequality, high levels of unemployment, and Puerto Rico was going through a major economic crisis, indeed over $72 billion debt that, given the economic situation in Puerto Rico, it was not able to pay back, and it's not able to pay back. The hurricane did not create this economic crisis or humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. It did exacerbate the economic crisis. If you take a look at the healthcare system in Puerto Rico, was already in a precarious situation before Hurricane Katrina. Indeed, 92% of the municipalities in Puerto Rico, 92% were already classified as underserved medically. With the changing demographic situation in Puerto Rico, the aging of the population, the grain of Puerto Rican doctors, and the deteriorating healthcare infrastructure, Hurricane Katrina exacerbated those healthcare conditions in Puerto Rico. That, combined with the ineffective and delayed response, resulted in close to 3,000 U.S. citizens on the island dying as a consequence of not only Hurricane Maria, but these pre-existing conditions. Also, when you take a look at migration in Puerto Rico, we indicate that Hurricane Maria created a massive migration from the island to the mainland, when in fact Puerto Rico was already undergoing one of its greatest migratory movements, actually the greatest migratory movement in its history, even greater than the migratory movement in the 50s and in the 60s. And so what Hurricane Maria did was exacerbate or accelerate that migration from the island to the mainland. Thus, the economic crisis already existing, the deterring healthcare infrastructure, the massive migration already existing in Puerto Rico, combined with the devastating impacts of this major hazard event in coordination with the lack of response, the delayed response, and the inefficient federal response in Puerto Rico really created what we see today as a major impact or major disaster that impacted the island. Now, if we focus on the response, federal response, as I said before, there were many controversies regarding the timeliness, the speed, and the magnitude of the overall response in Puerto Rico. And as I said before, this contributed to creating even greater economic, healthcare, and migratory circumstances in Puerto Rico. When you take a look at preliminary studies, for example, focusing on Florida, Hurricane Irma in Florida, and Hurricane Harvey in Texas, the response, the federal response, in both in terms of its timeliness and in terms of its funding, was faster and certainly more generous than it was in Puerto Rico. So as we respond to this event, and institutions of higher education respond to this event, it's important to understand those pre-existing conditions in the island and that were not the result of the hurricane, but that were exacerbated as a consequence of the hurricane. Shortly after this event, the state of New York, and particularly under the leadership of Governor Cuomo, started a major initiative which was called New York Stands with Puerto Rico, in which the state of New York invested millions of dollars and continues to do so in the response, recovery, and reconstruction efforts. As part of this initiative, the State University of New York, the SUNY system, established a SUNY-wide task force to focus on recovery and reconstruction efforts in Puerto Rico. I am the co-chair of that task force. During this past year or so, the SUNY system, has sent close to 900 students from 30 campuses to Puerto Rico, focusing on cleaning up beaches, on the restoration of the agriculture, focusing on reconstruction and restoration of houses, focusing on mental health issues. And so this is the way in which institutions of higher education can put together their resources and respond to these events. The University at Albany is clearly a leader within the SUNY system in responding to these types of initiatives. So we have established long-term, sustainable types of initiatives, not only to work on the recovery efforts, but to work on issues of resiliency, preparedness, and mitigation. And this is not only critical to help the people in Puerto Rico and communities respond and recover and recuperate from these events, it is an outstanding educational and transformational experience for our 900 students who have been in Puerto Rico, not only working, but raising awareness, generating education about Puerto Rico, its political, demographic, economic, and social reality, and educating students at Albany and throughout the SUNY system about the realities of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, which is part of the U.S., and in which 3.3 million U.S. citizens reside in today. So as a SUNY system, we as university presidents have come together to take advantage of the resources, the knowledge, the skills, the education we have in order to serve these communities and educate our populations.
Thank you, Havidan. Very much appreciated. Do we have time to go to the floor for some questions? One or two.
So I can't see.
Two people with the microphones. We can't see you.
So I'm in an orange sweater and she's in an orange scarf, pink. Do we have questions in the room, or we're all just devastated, or? All right.
Very good. Let's ask this very quickly. Takeaways. I say presidential involvement in planning and in resource allocation. Takeaway from Kathy.
I think it's critical for universities to create space for faculty and students to really engage in community activities and problem solving in the real world, as opposed to doing it in a purely theoretical sense. I'm really lucky to work at a university where interdisciplinarity is highly valued, but I think creating these spaces between the community and the university where people can really be creative and create better outcomes is a good idea.
Terrific. Anthony?
I think the Caribbean is one of those regions of the world that is on the front lines of the negative impacts of climate change. It just is.
Great. David?
Let me just.
He wasn't finished.
Whoops,
right?
I'm sorry.
If you want to attack climate change, right, and there are institutional investors in this room in the form of endowment funds or others, I would suggest and recommend that you put some of your capital, your impact capital, on the front lines of the negative impacts of climate change, whether that's the Caribbean or other regions that are on the front lines. Eventually, those front lines are going to be at your doorstep. Better to address them there than here. The last thing I'll say is that the financial services industry is going to come up with resiliency fund products, unfortunately so, right, for institutional investors to invest in. So there's two ways to address this. There's the prevention in terms of trying to get the Caribbean or other regions of the world off their dependency on fossil fuels and move their energy economies to renewable energy economies. And then the other side is investing in resiliency products that eventually are resiliency businesses that eventually are going to be the new norm.
David, now.
My takeaway is a strange one, but I want to share it because it ties some themes from this morning and certainly builds on President Rodriguez's point, is that we really do have to, as someone said this morning, look at the social justice aspects of environmental justice and environmental change. The problems that he talked about that existed in Puerto Rico that were only exacerbated by the hurricanes, that's so much of what's happening in communities, and especially urban communities and communities of color. You know, I have the fortunate benefit of having an institution, the only university, in an environment where a lot of those problems exist that I tried to briefly touch on. So what we are trying to do is having an impact on those particular issues. But I would just argue that all of us, to a certain extent, no matter where you live, have an island going on someplace that is experiencing similar types of problems, even though it's physically not an island. And as we think about our mission, we have to think about how can we address some of those problems that are already going on that island, whatever that island may be, next to your campus or down the road from your campus. And if we can start looking through that particular lens, then I think it will reframe this whole issue around sustainability, around resiliency, because it allows us to take more into account the human factor and the human suffering that is going on in this country and the world.
Thank you. Dr. Rodriguez.
I would say the critical importance of continuing to educate our students in the areas of resiliency and mitigation, but also doing so through student engagement and experiential learning, allowing our students to go out there to the field, not only to transform these communities, but to transform themselves about the impacts and consequences of these events.
Terrific. Panelists, we thank you.